chapter 11. That's where we're going to be this morning, in Mark chapter 11. And I'm just going to start right off the bat reading from Mark 11. So if you can go to the next screen, we're going to read our section, and then we're going to get into this. So it says in Mark 11, verse 12, "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, but it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who brought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple." And it goes on the next screen. "And he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. And as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots." And it goes on in the next screen. "And Peter remembered and said to him, 'Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered.' And Jesus answered them, 'Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses.'" So just a couple of questions for you this morning as we get started here. Excuse me. So the first question, how long was the 100-Year War? 116 years, right? That's how long it was. Now, second question, which country manufactures Panama hats? You're right, Ecuador. Next question, from what animal do we get catgut? You're right, sheep and horses. In which month, this is the last question, in which month do Russians celebrate the October Revolution? You're right, November. Now, just as confusing as those questions are, I think this passage that we're looking at here in Mark can be a little bit confusing. And we're going to see that. And maybe you saw that as we read it, like, what's going on here with the fig tree and Jesus getting angry and overturning all the tables and the temple and all of these things? Because it gives us these series of events that are on the surface really hard for us to connect. Because here's Jesus. He's entering into Jerusalem. And the first part of Mark 11 is called the triumphal entry. We kind of skipped over that this morning. But that's what's happening right before all of this that we've read today. Jesus comes in riding on the donkey, and he's being declared as the Messiah. And people are waving palm branches, and people are laying their coats down on the road. And people, they've been longing for this Messiah to come. So there's this excitement now that Jesus is riding in, that maybe he is the Messiah. And from this triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Jesus then goes into the temple. And the temple was the very center of Jewish worship, right? The temple was the place for their religious life, their national life. The temple was the place for this Messiah, king to be crowned. Where he should have been crowned, right? This is where he was going into. This is where Jesus' authority should have been first noticed and recognized. The temple is the place where, he could go and people would accept his sovereignty, his kingship, his lordship. The temple is the place where he would go, where there would be fruitfulness, where there would be life. This is where what this place should be. And you would think that the Messiah, he would go into the temple because this is the place where God communicated with his people. It was here in the temple. You think that the Messiah would go into the temple, and this is where he would start and immediately start his reign as the king. But Jesus goes in, and this is right before we've read. We see that actually Jesus goes in, and then he leaves. And as he's coming back into Jerusalem the next day, this is where our reading picked up. He passes a fig tree. And it wasn't uncommon for people in this time to go by a tree, a fruit tree of any kind, and if they were hungry, they would take something from it and eat it. And Jesus goes by this fig tree that has leaves on it, but Mark notes for us here that it wasn't the time for fruit to be on the tree. It wasn't the season for figs yet. In other words, you would not expect to find a ripe fig on this tree. But Jesus is hungry, and he goes over to see, that there's leaves on the tree, and he says he sees that it doesn't have any fruit on it. And so Jesus curses the tree. And we're told that the disciples hear him do that. And then they continue on into Jerusalem, and now they go back into the temple the next day. This is the next day from the other day before, right? And this is the part where Jesus begins to clean out the temple, overturn the tables that would have had the money exchanging going on them, tables that would have had the pigeons and doves that were used for the sacrifices on them. And Jesus sees what's going on in the temple, and he just shuts it down. He ends everything that's happening there. He stops worship at the temple for this whole day. Like, he stays there. He runs everybody out of there, and he doesn't allow anybody to come back in. Whole day. This is what happens. And I think that the 12 disciples were just as stunned as everybody else that day as what's happening here. Like, they had no idea what was going to happen. They see Jesus just clean house. And it's all by himself. Jesus started just throwing over tables and blocking people from entering into the temple and saying, "Get out of here. Don't do this. You can't bring that through into the courts." And he stormed over to the merchants saying, "Get out of here. Get your business out of here." And then at the end of the day, Jesus leaves. And he comes back by that fig tree that he had cursed. And Peter says, "Hey, Jesus, did you see this? Do you see the fig tree? That the tree is withered and dead now. It's like dead all the way to its roots." And it's almost like Jesus ignores what Peter says to him. He doesn't even listen to him or respond to it. And he just goes on from that moment to preach on faith and prayer and forgiveness. And as reading this passage, if you're reading it to get an idea of what Jesus is like and who Jesus is, you might say, well, there's kind of something wrong with Jesus here, right? Like, what's going on with all this? Here he is at the temple, throwing tables over, yelling at people. Maybe Jesus is really just hungry, and he didn't get a fig at the tree there, and he's just really, really hungry. And maybe if one of the disciples had handed Jesus a Snickers bar and said to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, you aren't you when you're hungry. Eat a Snickers," none of this would have happened. I don't know, right? Like, what is going on with Jesus here? What's happening? It almost seems like one fig tree sets Jesus off on this course of wildness, craziness for the rest of the day, right? Like, what happened to the loving Jesus? Because anyone who gets that irate and physical, surely they must be not walking in the Spirit, right? We would think that way sometimes. But this is Jesus. This is Jesus here. How do we make sense of this whole situation that's happening here? Well, one of the things that would be apparent to the first century readers of Mark, that's probably not really apparent to us, is the literary structure that's happening in this story that sandwiches these events together. So, Mark has the temple accounts in the middle of these two fig tree parts, just like a sandwich. So the focus of any sandwich is always what's in the middle, right? No matter how good the bread is, if the middle's not any good, the sandwich isn't any good, right? And so that's the focus of this whole section, what's happening in the middle. And what Mark wants us to understand is what Jesus does in relationship with the temple. So what's taking place in the temple? What worship is taking place in the temple? And you may say, well, doesn't God want us to worship him? Well, of course he does. That's why we're gathered here today, to come to worship and to sing praises to him and to hear from the word of God. God loves our worship. He longs for it. But Jesus here is addressing and attacking what's taking place in the temple because it's no longer good. It's just like the fig tree. It has leaves, but there isn't any fruit. And so the temple has a lot going on, but it doesn't have any fruit at this moment. And one commentator says, and I'm going to read this, he says, Israel's outward display of religious vitality was impressive, but misleading, like the leaves on a fig tree. But it bore no spiritual fruit of righteousness. It was hypocritical. So the worship at the temple had become corrupt. In Mark chapter 7, we've been there already, but in Mark chapter 7, we saw some of the leaders of worship in the temple had come to see Jesus. And then Jesus says this about him. It's on our next screen here. This is in Mark chapter 7, verse 6. And it says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." He's saying they're just going through the motions. They are insincere in what they're doing, that their worship is corrupt and it's not real. And so the worship at the temple had become taxing for the people. You see, to make an offering at the temple in that day, in Jesus' day, you had to come and change the common currency of the day to temple currency, and they were charging a fee for that conversion. And it was taxing on the people. It was expensive. The worship of the temple had become oppressive. It was in the way that they were relating to the poor people, the lower economic people in their society. By having the doves and the pigeons there, they were making allowances for the poor people to make sacrifices instead of having their own lambs or bulls for sacrifices. But they would sell these birds so that people could worship, but they were price gouging with these when the people would come to worship. And so it was wrong and it was oppressive for the people. And so these are the things that Jesus is angry about when he goes into the temple. So he comes into the temple the day on the triumphal entry, and he leaves. And he comes back the next day. And this is all offensive to God. And Jesus calls the temple a den of thieves. In other words, people who are evil, people who do injustice, people who do wrong, feel safe there. That's what he's saying. There's no retribution. You have this safe haven here for evildoers in the temple, and he said it shouldn't be this way. And so was Jesus' attack against the people at the temple mild? Was it unclear what Jesus was against here? No, not at all. Everybody knew that was there that day what Jesus was doing. He was very firm and he was very strong. Think about it this way. If your home or your school or your work became corrupt, how would you respond to it? I think that we would respond very strongly against that, right? This is what Jesus is doing here. And like most Christians, I love the mental picture of Jesus as the good shepherd with a lamb on his shoulders as he's carrying it to safety. I love the image of the baby Jesus in the manger. I love the story of Jesus feeding the multitudes with a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish and multiplying that. And when I think about Jesus dying on the cross to pay for my sin, man, that deeply moves me. I even marvel at the sight of Jesus bursting out of the tomb after his death on the cross 3 days later, resurrection morning. Here, in Mark chapter 11, this isn't the image of Jesus that we're seeing here. And what happens with us is that we have some misconceptions about God and about Jesus on how we think that they should act in certain ways. We have those misconceptions. Many people have this picture of God the Father as this image of this grandfatherly figure, that he's this nice grandfather that wants you to come in and listen to his stories, and he has wise things to say to us, and you enjoy spending time with him, and God never gets angry. Or some people think of Jesus that he's this peace-loving, happy kind of guy, right? Like he's really laid back and he wears sandals and he never gets really upset about anything. And we think about God and Jesus this way, but we disconnect from the truth of what the Bible reveals to us about God and about Jesus and how they expressed anger at times. And how they expressed anger in the right, correct way. Jesus demonstrated anger. And if you read even just the Gospels alone, we would see this in the life of Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus looks at the Pharisees in anger because they exhibited such a hard heart. Have you ever had anybody look at you in anger? You go to the next screen here. Moms are good at this, right? Like, all they have to do is just give you that look, and you know that you have done something wrong. You see this in Mark chapter 10 as well, that Jesus becomes angry with the disciples for not letting the children come to him. In Matthew 23, he calls the Pharisees hypocrites, snakes, and vipers. Just call somebody those things and see how they respond, right? Jesus and God don't have a problem with anger, but we do. We have a problem with it. Why? Well, for many of us, we've been on the abusive side of anger in our lives. And anytime we think of anger, we put a stop sign up. Like, no, we don't want that. I don't want anybody to get angry. And some of us have been abandoned in anger. Some of us, we know maybe somebody that we know got so angry with us that they just left. Some of us have problems dealing with our anger. Some of us are exploders. You get so angry and you just explode. Some of us are stuffers of our anger, and we just stuff that anger inside of us, and at some point we implode. We don't handle anger very well, and we've rarely ever seen anybody deal with anger in the right way, how it's handled well. And for most of us, when it comes to anger, we don't want any part of it. But the thing is if we are alive, which we are here today, right? We're going to get angry from time to time. Anger's going to happen. We're going to have to deal with anger. You go to the next screen. Ephesians 4:26. Paul says here, be angry and yet do not sin. Here Paul tells us to be angry. The command here, be angry. That just doesn't sound right, does it? Being commanded to be angry. But this is what he's doing. We're uncomfortable with a command like this. We find ourselves trying to avoid or explain this command away. Be angry. Because anger doesn't sound godly. Doesn't sound right. It's probably not likely that you've gone to your friends, you've gone to your spouse, you've gone to your kids, whatever it is, your neighbors, and you just said to them, hey, here's something for you to do today. Be angry. We don't do that. We don't tell people to be angry. And here Paul tells us to be angry. He says if you have a cause to be angry, but he says be angry and do not sin. If it's possible, is it possible to be angry and not sin? Well, we know Jesus never sinned in all that he did. And so Jesus here in Mark chapter 11 and elsewhere, as we've already looked at this morning, he got angry at times. But Jesus displayed a different kind of anger, and it was called righteous anger. So what is righteous anger? You can go to the next screen. Righteous anger. That is anger that is rightly demonstrated and directed against sin, evil, and injustice with the aim of redemption and restoration. That's the aim of righteous anger. Goes against the thing that is wrong so that we can restore the people. Find redemption. It's anger that's rightly demonstrated. It's shown in the right way, and it's directed at the right things. Righteous anger can be an incredible, powerful force for good. We don't have to fear righteous anger. You can go to the next screen. So what are some of the characteristics of righteous anger? Here's the first one. It's expressed at the right things in the right way. God's anger is expressed at sin. When we sin, we're making our own declaration of independence against God. And we're saying, God, I believe my way is better. I know what you've said, and I know what your word says, and all these things, but I just think my way is better, and I'm going to go about it my way. I'm smarter in the way that I think, and I think my way is more important than yours, God. That's basically what we're saying, and that is an offense to God. God responds to our unrighteousness with a righteous anger. And so you address the sin to eliminate the sin and not the person. That's what you do. You go to the next screen, and then the next thing is righteous anger is slowly provoked. And some people will struggle with God getting angry because they've been around people who have gotten angry, and it got crazy right off the bat, like immediately crazy. Or you didn't know what was going to set somebody off, and so you had to like tiptoe around them so you would not set them off or anything. Right? And then something happened, and immediately they were angry. Well, God is not like that. The next screen, Exodus 34, verse 6. And this is with Moses here. It says, "Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth." You see, God the Father and Jesus are not hotheads. They don't just explode in anger. That slow to anger up there, in the Hebrew, that literally means long of nose. We've talked about this before, but I'm going to quickly refresh you on this. In the Hebrew, that's long of nose. And so for the Hebrews, the way that they believe somebody got angry is that it started in their chest, and they would just start to, and then it would get into the neck, and the neck would come out, because they're getting angry, and then it would finally come out of the nose, and, that was how they believed somebody got angry. And so the longer your nose was, the longer it took for you to get angry. And so God describes himself as long of nose, slow to anger. He's not quick in anger, he's slow to anger. Then the next screen, righteous anger is justified and appropriate. When we see Jesus get angry, it's a justified response to what's happening. There are times when anger is the appropriate response. Today in our culture, we're told that we've got to mute our anger. We say it's not a big deal. Don't fuss over that thing. Don't get worked up over that. Don't try to get fired up over all those things. But there are times when righteous anger is appropriate. It's the right thing. There are times when we need to be angry, and if we don't deal with that thing, then, that thing that makes us angry, if we don't deal with that, then we're going to sin. And sometimes when we hear the things that are happening that aren't right, that are going on that aren't right, God uses that to get us angry, to do something about it, to stand up and deal with it. Righteous anger gets us involved in the situation. You go to the next one. Righteous anger is also controlled, measured, and clearly communicated. You see, in Mark chapter 11, verse 11, and this is going before our reading this morning, and I want to go back to this. This has something that can be easily missed, and I want us to really look at this here this morning, because if we're not careful, we'll miss it. We're going to see what's going on here. And it says in verse 11, "And he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Jesus comes into the temple after the triumphal entry. He looks around at what's going on, and he leaves. What would he have seen in the temple that day? He would have seen how the tables were set up and the money changers were there. He would have seen the doves and the pigeons and everything. And he doesn't immediately address any of this, but he just leaves for the day. But I guarantee he's thinking about it. He's praying about it. He's asking God what he should be doing about this or do about this. And so we see that Jesus' righteous anger is measured and it's controlled. And then the next day, we see that his righteous anger is clearly communicated to the people. When he flips over the tables and he sends everybody out, it isn't unclear what he's doing there that day. He lets them know. And the thing is our anger will never attain to the levels of righteousness that Jesus has. So it's inappropriate for us to think that we can get so angry at something that we should start flipping over tables and chairs. I don't care how bad that Monopoly game's going. We don't do that, right? We don't go there. We aren't Jesus. But sometimes anger requires a strong response. Maybe it's a pounding of the table. Maybe it's you raise your voice a little bit. But it's not something that's abusive. Jesus never did his anger in an abusive way, but it was in an appropriate way. And we have to remember that we are not Jesus. And our level of righteousness will never be at Jesus' level of righteousness. And when we exercise righteous anger, we're going to have certain limitations to that. And Jesus appropriately engages righteous anger physically. He's forceful, but he's not abusive, and he's clearly lets everybody know why he's angry. He takes them back to this passage in Isaiah 56 here, which these people would have known and would have heard very often in Isaiah 56. And he says to them in verse 17, I don't know if this is on the next screen or not, but he says in verse 17, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. See, it isn't unclear why Jesus is angry. Everybody knew. Now, why does God get angry? And some people think, well, isn't God supposed to just be loving? Why would God get angry? What's up with this? Well, if somebody harms somebody that you love, what do? We get involved in that situation. We don't just sit by idly and not do anything. If somebody harms somebody we love, we stand up and do something about it. We don't let that slide. The next screen. God gets angry because God loves. God loves, and he gets angry when we fail to respond to his word. He loves us, and he gets angry when we sin and we hurt others or we hurt ourselves. God gets angry because he's holy, he's just, and he loves. And the problem comes when we don't let God respond in anger in the same way that we allow ourselves to. And so God and Jesus show us righteous anger and what it's all about, and it's all about love. Now, if there is righteous anger, then there has to be unrighteous anger, right? So if you go to the next screen, what does unrighteous anger look like? Well, the first thing is it's self-serving. It's self-serving. Many times something happens to us, and we become angry, and we get frustrated with people because people interfere with our lives or interfere with the deal that we've got going on, and it makes us angry, right? Because they're stopping what we want to do or what we're having going on, and that makes us angry. You go to the next screen. James chapter 4 gives us some insight into this, and it says in verse 1, what is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. You see, James tells us that we're selfish and that our anger springs from our selfishness. Our anger is very self-serving. Then on the next screen, unrighteous anger is subjective versus objective. Let me explain that here this morning. Subjective anger doesn't focus on the offense, but it focuses on the offender. And so all of my anger and energy is assigned to that person who has hurt me and not the offense that has happened. And so I'm angry at you when there's really something that has caused that anger. For some people, there has been a lot of bad things that have happened to you. There have been times maybe that you've been betrayed, you've been overlooked, maybe you were bullied at some point, and you've just stored up all of those things in your life. And then every offense that happens against you isn't really about the offense, but it's about all of those things that have happened to you in the past. That's subjective anger. Subjective anger is explosive and dangerous. It's hurtful. And we have to get rid of the subjective anger, and we have to go to objective anger. And objective anger focuses on the offense that happened. And when you focus on the offense, you allow that person who offended you to help focus on the offense so that you're able to come up with a solution on how to deal with the offense. Like you work together with the person who hurt you, and you don't attack them, but you would deal with the thing that happened. And so how do we turn from subjective into objective in our lives? Well, you have to dig the source up. Like, what happened? What are you angry about? And this passage that we looked at in James chapter 4 will help us. Like, what desires in your life are unmet? What passions in your life are unfulfilled? Are there unrighteous or righteous things? Are there any sin there? And we all need people in our lives to help us figure these things out, to answer these questions. You need to name these things specifically. Like, this right here is what I'm mad about in my life. And you have to determine a time and a place to deal with the offense. And for many of us, that will mean confession and repentance time. And then you go to the next screen. Unrighteous anger is unbridled and unrestrained. In Proverbs 29, verse 11, says, "Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end." It's important to notice that this verse doesn't say that it's wrong to vent your anger, but it's wrong to give full vent to your anger. It's reckless to give full vent to your anger at somebody. So how do we temper our anger? Well, there's a few ways. Maybe you could try this. You could try to write down everything that you're angry about and then read it out loud to yourself. And sometimes when you do that, you're going to see that the thing that you're angry about isn't really that big deal. And that's sometimes, not always. Sometimes it is a big deal. Or you can just think about your anger for a little bit. Process it. Pray about it. And then allow God to show you if this is a righteous or an unrighteous anger. And then on the next screen, unrighteous anger is damaging and dividing. Proverbs 15:18 tells us a hot-tempered person starts fights. A cool-tempered person stops them. And so if you're hot-tempered, you're probably going to divide a lot of people. You're going to have people divided from you if you're hot-tempered. People that you love are going to be divided from you. And it's because of the unrighteous anger that you have in your life. And every one of us has experienced a broken relationship because of sin and anger. Every single person has sinned. And how does God view sin? God hates sin, and it makes him angry. I'm a sinner, and God gets angry at sin, and God is angry at me. That's the bad news. The good news is that Jesus took on God's wrath and our sin through his death on the cross to restore us. God's anger that was due for me was placed on Jesus. God's anger and wrath that I should have fully expected to receive on myself, Jesus intervened for me. God sent Jesus to intervene for me. And God put his wrath on him, on Jesus. He did it so that we might be forgiven, that we might be sons and daughters. That's the good news right there. That's the good news. Now, some of us have some work to do with other people. Think today about how your anger, how has it been unrighteous or has it been sinful? Think about, who have I hurt with my anger? And God may be saying to you today is the day that you reconcile with those people. Like, what is God calling me to do in response to this? Well, let's ask God this morning what to do. And let's say yes to him. I'm going to ask you to bow your heads, and we're going to take communion together in a little bit. But I want us to go to God before we get to communion here. Because we're told in 1 Corinthians that we should take a look at ourselves before we take communion. And maybe there's some places in our lives where our anger has gotten the best of us, and it's been unrighteous anger, and we've caused hurt to the people around us. And so with our heads bowed in prayer right now, I want you to ask God, where has my anger been unrighteous and sinful? God, where have I hurt somebody in my anger? God, is there anybody that I need to reconcile with right now? Would you just take a moment and ask God those questions?